Three, two, one. Bingo. Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, hello, hello to you.
Good evening.
Thank you very much.
Uh,
I'm excited to start your day for you and end mine.
right. I've been rambling so much. I feel like it's lunch hour already. Uh, but that being said, oh my God, just give me a second here. Oh, hold on.
I think it's time for our speedy stream.
I know, right? It's
I
like
don't know.
reminder. It's like reminder. You're late. I know, right? Um, Mademoiselle Jodie Chan, is that correct?
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Parfait,
C'est
parfait,
moi.
parfait, parfait. Introducing Jodie Chan. Uh, how are you?
I'm doing very, very well. It's actually been very timely because I feel like I haven't had one of these conversations and reconnection with the wonderful family that's in web performance, and I miss them so very dearly. I missed the Halloween special of Perf Now last year. It's the first conference I've missed in a while, and I really missed out, I'm sure. But to be fair, for a good reason. So I did have a baby, and I guess I'll either have to bring her soon to the next round or yeah, to find a way to see you
Well,
guys.
well, congratulations on motherhood, first of all.
Thank you very
Uh,
much.
uh, and, uh, you know, we are glad to be able to get some of your time because I know parenthood is absolutely bananas. Like we've been on the stream here like 20 minutes. I feel you're already probably 20 minutes behind, you know, when it comes
Don't
to
worry
parenthood.
about it.
You
It
know?
teaches you to let go and let flow and just be efficient where you can and focus on the things that matter.
Yep, yep, absolutely. I mean, it's a bit of a long drawn out intro. I have to apologize about that. Like I said, it's like LinkedIn's apparently still down. I don't know what's going on, but that's totally fine. But we are here today to talk about a bunch of different things, but we're going to primarily talk about obviously performance because that's what we do discuss here, but certainly performance in one of the more challenging geos around the world, which is China. And again, I've heard your presentation in the past. It was just fascinating, you know, tons of insights. And you also published recently a report, speaking of insights, a report about the state of performance in China. We'll get to that in a hot second. But I like to start the stream in the following fashion. Uh, Please, by all means, introduce yourself to the audience, tell them who you are, what you do, and we'll go from there.
All right. Well, my name is Jodie Chan. And for the last, I would say almost 5 years, the company Chinafy and I've been working on solving one of the biggest issues that I think has been more of a mystery and a black box for a lot of people to solve. And the background behind this is being in Hong Kong, we've always been the city where East meets West and West meets East. And you have this really exciting intersection of different sort of companies, and kind of treating Hong Kong either as a gateway to China or from China to the rest of the world. And because of that, I think that exposure, one question that keeps getting brought up is how are ideas being translated? How is the internet working? Where are the differences and where are the similarities? And so Chinafy, this project that we've been so focused on, really is about tackling the web performance gaps that exist for global companies and the challenges that they face in entering the world's largest, second largest market, China, and hopefully making it a little less painless, because I think at the end of the day, businesses really, obviously you have a lot of macro factors in play at all times. But on the ground level, what I've found through personal experiences, businesses and people still want to talk and communicate with one another. And so hopefully we're contributing to making that a little bit easier.
Absolutely. Now, if you don't mind me asking, like, when did you join Chinafy?
Well, actually, I've been here since the start, since it was a seedling of an idea. I've actually been with the parent company Noti for 10 years now, probably almost 10 years actually by this summer. And the projects that we've always been working on has always been around, high performance enterprise, B2B SaaS solutions. And we like tackling difficult things like data management platforms for publishers, trying to build multi-language solutions that didn't exist. I mean, I would say one of the earliest products we built was before Webflow even had their multi-language functionality. We were some of the first people to actually do that for some of the largest publications in Asia. And through these conversations, Chinafy came as an idea because we were able to see these problems keep coming up. These companies would then come to us, how can you solve this problem for us? We've built these really wonderful dynamic websites and experiences, but as a global company, we need to keep China in mind. And how can we make sure that it's working in China because it doesn't? And so I've been with Chinafy since, like I said, it was a seedling and now it's the demand has proven well, I think it's proven itself, and it's been very encouraging to see people becoming more aware of this really, really big problem and the urgency in which they have to fix it, which is a good challenge for us too.
Absolutely. Now, we were just speaking earlier, and you're saying that you were born and raised in Hong Kong. Now, that being said, did you even have were your experiences just prior to, joining, the parent company, prior to working at Chinafy, were your experiences kind of like along the lines of what the experience is in China right now? Like, what was the market like in Hong Kong where you were like, oh, you know what, internet's not amazing, but this is what we know. And now you realize how, challenging internet, challenging, presence in particular markets is a very important thing to solve.
Well, what's really interesting is and I'll answer your question in 2 parts. So, Hong Kong is a bit of a it's a special administration region. So, it used to be a British colony, and it's always kind of operated under its own ecosystem. Eh, not to get too into politics, but it's 2 systems, 1 city, and so growing up, pretty much the internet environment for us in Hong Kong is like that of anywhere else. Any major city, internet is expected to be fast. We're able to access, more importantly, the tools that you can access everywhere else. So you've got LinkedIn, you've got Google, and everything under Google. So many things under Google. And then you have obviously all the social media platforms and things like that. What I will say though is whenever we went into China, though I haven't done that as much until I mean, I've traveled quite frequently to the mainland, um, as well, is that the internet is actually very fast, and it is one of the most mobile first dynamic cities out there. One of the things that I always tell people that shocks them is you can pay your taxes with the same social media app that you are using to game, the same one that you're using to book a car, the same one that you're using to give a lycée, Chinese New Year to your friends. It's the same massive ecosystem, and you're able to do that. You don't even need cash, and this will be true in a mom and pop shop or anywhere else. And so, to answer your question in 2 parts, being in Hong
Mhm.
Kong, we have essentially no issues, and I mean, there are some exceptions now with, like, certain AI tools and things like that we can't access, without a VPN. So, Hong Kong is super, super international in that sense, and similarly in China, it has its own dynamic ecosystem, and the expectations are just as high, if not higher. But the gap, it remains actually communicating from that international ecosystem to the one in mainland China and vice versa.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's definitely something we're gonna get into, very shortly. Amazing. So essentially, Hong Kong is definitely, world-class tech, international, no real hiccups when it comes to, accessing the internet and using
For the most part, with the exception now again of AI tools and things like that, TikTok. But for the most part, yes, we are
Awesome.
mostly on Google Meets if anyone, hops in a meeting with us by default, unless we're calling someone from mainland China, in which we'll use WeChat or something like that.
Got you, got you. Uh, I'll follow this up with the question that I ask people each and every time, each and every guest that comes through uh, on the Speedy Stream. What is your earliest memory of deciding that you were going to work in the performance space? So basically, was it like a blog post? Was it like a top that you watched once? Uh, I don't know, was it, an experience that you had where the internet was so poor that it just was it just stayed with you? Do you remember what that might have been?
Um, I feel like my story is probably a bit more organic. I think it is coming
Okay.
from the expectations of these people and companies that we work for. And one of the first things I think people in general are very impatient. And we are very
Mhm,
impatient because we're used to things being fast. So the faster they are, the faster our metrics have to be. It's almost like we're chasing this invisible goal. And I think
mhm,
I distinctly remember when using, a mobile phone for this first loading screen to happen, when I got my first phone, I already felt like it was super, super fast. But now, the moment I distinctly remember seeing that loading icon, the Mac, the signature rainbow Mac loading icon, and that would
mhm,
bring such an emotional experience to see that icon and not know when it was gonna end and when it was gonna leave.
mhm,
And I
mhm.
literally had this thought the other day. I was like, well, at some point, waiting 1 second or let's say waiting 10 seconds was already a wow moment. But nowadays, if you wait more than what, 1 second for something
Yep,
to like, even just for any app to open, it's just too long. It's almost like our
yep.
expectations have changed. So I feel that most from my own personal experiences, but more or less demanding customers that definitely made it to that point.
And it's good because, in my experience, it's been very interesting watching this sort of, uh, kind of like wide range of experiences that, drove people into the space. I've talked about Robin Marks. He had this academic, side to it. Same with the people at SpeakIt, actually. Like the SpeakIt
Yeah.
project was actually built in in school, you know, and but then you had someone like Scott Gell, or even Jakob Gross, who both talked about just like very personal experiences that made them realize how poor, you know, things could be on mobile. If you don't look after performance. So it's always good to hear what is the sort of like that sort of like aha moment that some people have that kind of drive them into the space and try to do better work. Now, speaking of
If I
work,
might interject. Oh, sorry.
please. No, no, no,
I
no. Go
just
ahead.
wanted to say one observation I've had in meeting all these wonderful web performance people is, a lot of them actually speak about web performance quite romantically. I don't know if you've noticed that it's almost like I think it's this really strong belief that using technology and using the web should be an enjoyable, joyful experience, and I think it
Absolutely.
really just comes down to that motivation to make it a more pleasurable one, and so it's funny, it's just when you mention all these people, I'm like, "Ah, these friends, I love talking to them because they speak with such excitement and such purity and think of something so technical in a very romantic way." But that's an
Yeah.
aside.
No, it's great because and it's absolutely true because we're talking about a community of folks who just absolutely believe in the web and that it should be as the web being an essential service. And I talked about this with Dave Belson that, it should be as smooth as possible. It should be as natural as possible. It shouldn't be, you know, like, and I'll get to this in probably in future episodes, but, making sure that the web is super resilient so that, when these hiccups come about, that hopefully it's still smooth, right? And these are things that I'm sure that you have to deal with on a continual basis over at Chinafy, which is what I definitely want to jump into literally right now, because I know that a few weeks ago, Chinafy released a report, sort of like summarizing some of the industries and in operating or trying to operate in China, and some of the results that were that you guys shared were again just stunning in terms of just what was taking place. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull it up. The state of global website performance in China. Now, for those who might not know, like the importance of performance in China, if you had to summarize it and say it like one sentence, how would you do so?
I would say that China performance issues are architectural in nature and not as people think, it's not cosmetic. And it's definitely not as simple as people think in terms of solving. That's a sentence and a half.
No, which is quite fine. I do wanna ask you, what do you mean about it's not cosmetic?
Well, I think that oftentimes when people look at a website, and we have definitely talked to companies, when they describe a problem to us, they say, "Hey, it looks like there's a problem with my website in the way that it's being designed. The video is missing and the fonts aren't working." And when you say something like that, it's very easy to interpret it to think, okay, in terms of cosmetics, something just doesn't look right, right? But actually, when I say it's architectural, it means that at every single layer, not to use the OSI model too much, just from a concept basis, let's just say in a more accessible way, there's so many levels of things that happen behind a website, right? You have the
Mhm,
servers that are powering it, you have the network, you have the browser. At every single layer, there's actually probably a challenge or a problem that's then causing the issue that you're seeing up top. And
mhm,
so when we say China performance is architectural, it's at the very foundational layer. There are a lot of things that are happening that you need to solve one by one at each layer before you can reach the end user, so to speak, or the web visitor in something that they
mhm.
see.
As you say that, it just made me remember something that you had mentioned, back at, Perf Now. By the way, folks, uh, the first time I ran into Jodie was, her presentation at Perf Now in 2003, I believe. Uh, and if I could sort of like put up the sort of like mind blown emoji, that's what it was. I was listening to this going, holy smokes, like, what am I hearing right now? And it was so exciting because I've always been partial to the idea of looking at um, data from different geos. We could talk about the G7s all the time, maybe even the G20s, whatever. But um, taking a look at what the or how the internet is being consumed outside of your usual areas, always super duper important. And so when I was hearing this from Jody in terms of like what was going on in China, I was like, I had no idea. I had heard a couple rumors, yeah, bad internet, whatever, but this was like completely off what I knew. So, thank you for that, by the way. And folks, what I'll do is I'll share the link to her talk in the show notes. Now, you had mentioned something in that talk that maybe we could sort of like tackle right now because it feels like the infrastructure that you were talking about, which was
Thing.
I think you'd mentioned that 95% of traffic was going through state governed ISPs. Now, it was this creating part of the challenge of operating in China?
Well, I definitely think that it is a variable, but I like to
Mhm,
kind of focus on the variables we can fix versus the ones we can't do anything
mhm,
about. But I do think it is important to highlight that traffic concentration is a real challenge when it comes to China. I think I don't, Cloudflare sent a really great report out there about how it would compare versus North America and Europe. And I think it was in the
mhm,
60s plus, if not 70 plus, in terms of the equivalent in those markets
mhm,
versus China, where the ISPs are you've got, China Mobile, China Telecom. I think
mhm,
there's a fourth one, like a very small share. There's China Unicom, but I think
mhm,
those 3 are the ones that we can focus on, and traffic concentration is very real. And so
mhm,
it does impact, obviously, that experience and the added
mhm,
latency, um,
mhm.
for every website going through.
These are not, and again, maybe I'm sort of like off base here, but these aren't sort of like state, controlled ISPs who then start to sort of like manage the content that's coming into the country.
Well, they are state-owned, and I won't venture
Mhm,
to say that I can represent, the Chinese Ministry of Internet Technologies. I do think a good analogy that I try to use here to stay very neutral on the subject is that
mhm,
in Asia, oftentimes in a lot of households, when you enter it, you take off your shoes and you walk
mhm,
in without your shoes, right? It's just kind
mhm,
of if you are to enter a market, you do kind of have to play by their rules. And part
mhm,
of it, they have different reasons for why they do this. I won't say, how like, why or to venture into explaining that, but I do think that there is a degree, obviously, of that content being reviewed, right?
mhm,
Oftentimes, people will use the broader umbrella term of a China's Great Firewall,
mhm,
like the Great Wall of China, because there is some sort of barrier in which content flows and something happens to it in between. So
Mhm.
so to your degree, the state-owned ISPs is contributing to how that happens, I would say.
Like, I'm trying to think of all these things, or was at the time thinking of all these things that could sort of like create these hurdles, these bottlenecks, and you had mentioned like
Absolutely.
how some things work and some things will not, period, and
It's true. That's
that
true.
yeah, was one that made me kind of chuckle for a second was the idea that TikTok was not operating in China or was not working in China. I'm like, that's interesting. ByteDance's own product is not loading in China, which is again, uh, the irony there.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it's interesting when you think about it that way is I think it's a good example to raise, only because China has the equivalent pretty much of every technology that you can think of that you use day to day. So, obviously, ByteDance being the parent company, TikTok and Douyin, which is the same but separate version. I think a more obvious example would be, Google versus Baidu. I think those are the kind of the big comparisons because you've got Google as a primary search engine, you've got Baidu for the primary search engine. Let's say you've got Instagram, you've got YouTube and all these different platforms. They also have Youku in China, and then the I wouldn't say the exact Instagram same is Xiaohongshu. There are parallels basically. And so what I do think is interesting about the Chinese market that if you travel around Asia, you might notice that let's say markets like Korea or Japan, they have their own tools. You have to use your local maps. You have to use their own Uber might not work. You might have to use Kakao Maps instead of Google. There's so many different tools that you have to use in those markets. But what's unique about China is that there's this variable, and then there is the ISP variable, and then there's the added variable of it being the second largest market in China. There are just so many compounded elements that make China so unique in terms of the things that you have to check off the box before you are able to be operational, more or less. And so, I think when you talk about geos, I find it personally very fascinating because it's just an amalgamation of all these variables that impact that user experience and web performance specifically.
let's start to sort of like dig into some of these numbers. So, what we have now pulled up is the state of global website performance in China, and it goes through like everything that you've done. Over 600 global sites to double check. Now, let's look at this first row of data points here. So, 66%, just over, uh, are not loading successfully in Beijing. Now, are you defining successfully in a particular way, or it's just like just the average, successful load, which would be, I don't know, like 3 to 5 seconds or something along those lines? Is this what you're meaning there?
Yeah, so I think a bit of context in terms of the methodology for this report would be quite
Mhm.
helpful. We've
Please.
used a lot of the tools from our wonderful friends at Web Page Test, so Catchpoint, who
Mhm.
we love working with as well, and it's a combination of uh, it's mostly RUM data that we are using,
Mhm.
and when we define success, we're actually using visual load time. So if you
Mhm.
scroll down, I think you are welcome to kind of dig into the how of each statistic, uh,
Mhm.
and the median, the way that we draw those, the browser that we're using being Chrome, the network being cable, which is why, I think some of the first questions someone will ask is, "Well, like, on what network did you test this on? Is it really
Mhm.
truly reflective of the situation?" And we're saying we're using the best possible networks to give you the most realistic best case scenario for a lot of these websites. And when we say load successfully, it's based on the visual load times.
Got you, got you, got you. So kind of like a speed index to an extent.
Yeah, so you can say it's perceived success based on the visitors' metrics.
Got it, got it. Now, you're saying here, again, I'm just kind of going through some of the data,
Go for it.
17.2 seconds to visually load in Beijing, with users typically abandoned after 3. So essentially, on a day-to-day basis, people are waiting well past 15 seconds to see like anything on in the viewport, is what you're saying.
If anything at all. I think what's really fascinating is the number of timeouts that happen actually for every single, website and the percentages in which we see them happening. I mean, if you look at, let's say, other markets, and I think even for this test, we've used Virginia and, London specifically in the UK for control, and you can actually see, timeouts do happen. It's a part of the problems that some of our wonderful friends are solving. directly themselves, right? So if we're talking about Virginia, you have maybe 6% in terms of timeouts. The London is about 5%. And then you talk about the average in Beijing, China, which is already one of the it is the primary city in which you can benchmark a lot of controls, is the timeout's 44%, right? And then you start digging to industries, and that number just is shocking for some of the industries and the size that we're seeing. And these are some of the top largest companies in the world who, frankly, I think really do care about China, but maybe to them there's a bit of a transparency issue or just visibility issue into the problem and how to fix it.
Mhm. Now, you just mentioned that, a lot of it, China's huge, and
It
that,
is.
a lot of the data points are coming out from, the Beijing perspective. Now, do you check in with any of the other sort of, like, large Chinese markets?
So actually at Chinafy, we do in general run tests frequently, time series analysis, etc. In-person tests, rum tests using all sorts of methodologies. And we do actually, on average, test around 6 different cities. But for the purpose of this report, I think it was easier to just narrow down one single city so that we could then kind of use that as a kind of a standardized benchmark. Because if a website does, let's say if a website loads well in China in a second tier or a third, unofficially less popular city, it is probably gonna be even faster in Beijing. It probably will mean that it'll do well in Beijing. If something is loading poorly in Beijing, it is very likely to do even worse in other cities. So that's kind of the thought process behind choosing that city.
Now, with respect to, you mentioned some of the, other industries and, I'm reading right here that hotels
Yep.
were worst performers. Now, what do you see hotels in terms of they're all making the same mistake. Do you know which mistake that would be? Because, I went through some of the details and some other industries were doing better in general. So there's something that the hotels are all doing together that is contributing to what might be, as you say, their worst performers.
Well, I don't have the responses for you just yet. Maybe this is the follow-up chat that we can have specific to these websites, but I do have a rough idea actually of, some gut feelings based on hotel websites that we frequented. So
Mhm,
I think for one, a lot of the hotel websites that we've seen, they're this partially goes towards also some of the web performance best practices, even outside of
mhm,
China, right? So it's making sure that these beautiful, gorgeous, uh, full width videos on the main page
mhm,
that you see of that website property is cached properly. It is
mhm,
loading fast. It doesn't interfere with how the rest of the page loads. What we've seen with hotel websites is a very, I would say it's designed to be visually compelling from the start,
mhm,
right? And so this often means a lot of different third party plugins. It often means a lot of content that's quite heavy that contributes to that page. And so if outside of China, you're experiencing a hotel website, I think there obviously things have improved over time, but there are definitely hotel websites that even in a very fast network situation outside of China, you'll find quite slow. And so if it's
mhm,
slow there, it's just slower tenfold when it comes to China. I mean, you see a lot more curtain loading behavior I've seen on hotel websites than most other industries. And so I would probably venture to say that's probably contributing to it is that maybe
mhm,
not all best web practices are adhered to, even
mhm.
before they are processed and improved for China.
Yeah.
What I will say is that what's interesting about hotels is when we talk to a lot of hotels and tourism companies, they mention, they really wanna increase direct bookings, right?
Mhm,
They have all the top tier tools, they're using a lot of plugins, they often use a third-party booking system, and they're really keen on driving direct bookings because you have, companies like Ctrip or the equivalent of these platforms taking a really large percent every time they make
mhm,
these bookings. And so the urgency and the pain point felt by hotels are really, really high. But the barrier for them to solve these problems really requires working and treating the roots of their web platforms and websites before they can kind of get to that next level.
mhm. So essentially, sort of like with the hotel issue, it seems like they were likely poor performers generally before they even entered the Chinese market. And then in the Chinese market, it was like all downhill.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a very good conclusion to reach for any industry or any website. If it's not working well outside of China, it's probably gonna work way worse when trying to
Mhm.
enter the Chinese market, especially if no optimizations or no particular work was done to fix that.
No, certainly. And you just mentioned also uh, made a mention of like best practices and whatnot, because certainly with a media rich website, you pretty much have to apply every best practice you can. Now, I know in the past you had mentioned that, best practices were just simply not enough in the Chinese market. Did you want to outline a few details as to why?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I'll do this kind of like a open question and answer. I think some people online would
Yeah.
definitely know the answer, but let's say a client comes to you and says their website is slow. What is the first thing that you think
Mhm.
of?
A heavy page width.
Okay, heavy page width.
Mhm.
And let's say I fix that. I'm be like, oh,
Mhm.
I don't know how I don't know how to technically fix my website, but I feel like I already used something like Shopify or
Mhm.
Adobe to build it. Shouldn't it already be assumed that things are working fast? And then I guess the response you'd probably say is there's probably some things we can still tweak, right? On every website that we build. And so
Mhm.
when I say that it's not sufficient is that even the most experienced developers, agencies, etc. out there, when you start going through the tools in your arsenal, such as, okay, do they have a CDN? Have we fixed the width? Have we fixed minifying JS? Have we done all the proper caching mechanisms? I mean, Harry Roberts, amazing expert in that space, that people aren't caching things properly. So you tackle and you do all these wonderful tweaks that are fantastic to make the original website faster. That,
Mhm.
sadly, is also not sufficient enough for making a website work in China. And
Mhm.
one of the key reasons behind that is basically with most third party we say third party resources on a website,
Mhm.
right? When you're thinking about, let's just say you use Adobe Cloud. Adobe Cloud assets are on a Adobe domain separate
Mhm.
to your main website. So anything outside the primary resources, right? We're talking about plugins that you have, API calls,
Mhm.
everything that actually is best practice to use outside of China, very likely, unless something is done to tweak and optimize it for China, it will cause the rest of the website to also fail to work very well, even if you've
Mhm.
done the best practices there. So when I say it's insufficient, it really is because you need special, expert, very specific actions to make a
Mhm.
website work in China.
Now, is something else that you just mentioned in your answer there. You had sort of brought up CDNs. And I know that, generally a CDN is going to be, fantastic for any site's, performance and, getting, users, that are being closer to the user, always going to be great for latency. But you've also mentioned that, CDNs do not solve the issue in China as well. Did you want to sort of like outline some of the details there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I kind of think of it like a puzzle, right? They're different pieces of
Mhm.
the puzzle. CDNs are fantastic. I mean, we at Chinafy partner with so many CDNs. We love using CDNs ourselves. We use it across our stack. So they're fantastic for what they do, which is
Mhm.
essentially accelerate primary resources on a website and making sure they're available and accessible to the end user. Now,
Mhm.
this is not to say that they don't solve the issue, they solve part of that puzzle, and I think that's what's
Mhm.
important to highlight is CDNs are fantastic, and then you add on something else that a CDN might have. Let's say a lot of CDNs have something called a global accelerator,
Mhm.
special features and products that they have to accelerate things, dynamic resources even faster. That's another part of the puzzle. But what CDNs and these accelerators are not designed to do is to address these third-party resources that exist on a website, simply because it's
Mhm.
not within their scope, it's not what they do. And that's also why Chinafy focuses on that piece of that puzzle, so that together you can create this very dynamic, healthy website stack that is able
Mhm.
to essentially, evolve as it needs to, because that environment in China is constantly evolving, right? Third-party resources and how they function is constantly evolving.
Mhm.
Even something as simple as Google Analytics. the way that Google Analytics events are fired or the way that they're structured change all the time.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
way that video embed codes also change all the time. So I think to answer that question more holistically is we love working with these different products simply because you need all of them to work together in order for that end user experience to be a joyful one.
Mhm. And, I brought up CDN again because I know in the past you'd mentioned, how CDNs were just not the savior that some people may believe it could be. And I have it, sort of like queued up here. You had mentioned here in the report that the CDN only problem is that CDN selection alone did not correlate with successful loading in China. Even websites using leading global CDNs and infrastructure can still face timeouts. And again, something that I'm sure people would find almost impossible. It's like, how's a CDN going to time out? But it's happening in the Chinese market. Performance by sector that I thought was pretty interesting. Now, you had mentioned that the hotels obviously timing out at 75% rate, which is, again, just mind blowing. Now, I was looking at some of the data here, like higher education, which seemed to have done a little better. Off the top of my head, I was thinking like, okay, what's it about higher education that may give them a bit of a boost. But, outside of a sort of classic, university website that's usually kind of sparse, it's like the odd picture here and there, it's mostly text. Is that something that would be recommended, say, off the top, to have a media light website to operate as best as possible in the Chinese market?
I would put it this way. So when you have a website, right, and a customer comes to you saying, I need this functionality, I need it to look this way, I need it to feel this way. I think one thing that, as developers or web performance community, we don't want to do is say, actually, these ideas of what you want, this vision that you want can't be realized if you want it to work in China. So normally what we'd like to flip the script is, yes, of course, you can have a static HTML custom built website hosted in China, assuming you meet all the requirements of the, ICP licenses and the PSB filing and things like that. You could go that approach. So that you check the functioning portion, but then you compromise a lot of the vision and the functionality and the dynamicness that you want that website to actually have. And so one thing to also highlight is oftentimes when these customers are coming to you, assuming, you guys are agencies or things like that, what they're talking about is having their global website work, right? And oftentimes if you ask them to, okay, now in order to make this global website work in China, you have to strip it to a media light website. Oh, and you might have to do all these other actions to make it work, it might not be worthwhile to them, and it might not make sense from a global brand perspective. So what with Chinafy we try to do is really understand the end goal here is so that hopefully people can build the way they want to, use the website the way they want to, do the things that you want to do on your, whether it's a cloud infrastructure, whether you want to streamline, whether it's dynamic, whether it's a platform or web application. Do what you need to do, and there are probably actions that can be done to build and generate a version of that website that works for visitors in China without having to rebuild one from scratch. That's kind of the intention behind that product, our product, and why we work so hard and makes it very, very technically complex to do. But I think the intention really matters.
The opportunity to just, not have to completely rebrand, for a market simply because of, technical hurdles, obviously is something that, a company is going to look for simply because they want the brand to be reflected in China like it is reflected in the rest of the world. Uh, I know you had talked about this in the past in at particular uh, I mean, certainly at Perf now. Did you want to give an example of a particular project that you can share where you were able to successfully maintain, their actual presence, like, marketing wise, design wise in China, like they were outside of the Chinese geo?
I would actually say it would be 99.5% of all websites that we've worked on look and feel more or less the way that they've been designed to. And that's something that we're very, very proud of. So we've got a full page of case studies. And I think one thing that is worthwhile to highlight is there are different let's just say different companies of different industries have different
Mhm,
requirements when it comes to entering to China. Some of these
mhm,
companies really do need to be hosted onshore in China for regulatory reasons. They might need a separate marketing language, copy, everything being different and specific to China, depending on their product, right? So these
mhm,
companies, normally when we work with them, they're saying, actually, can you help optimize the onshore version of our website that we've already built for China and make sure that
mhm,
it works better for visitors to China. So that's, one segment of the companies that we work with. And so the look and feel is based on what they've built for China specifically. The
mhm,
other segment are these international companies where, they've already done their legal and compliance regulatory work and said, actually, no, we can keep everything outside of China. We really want to just make sure our global presence is accessible. In which
mhm,
case, we're kinda like plumbing. You don't really have to think about us. You just need us to make everything that you've already built work the way that it should.
mhm,
You don't have to
mhm,
remember that we're there. And so, actually, I'll send, probably the case studies link I think would be really fun for people to dig through, depending on the industry they're in, to see actually, when you try to compare, and we have all the photos and everything, you can't really tell unless you're really looking for it and you go into Chrome Inspect that we've done something behind the scenes to make things work. So you might notice,
mhm,
"Hey, there used to be a YouTube video here, but now it's an MP4 video. Google Maps
mhm,
was here before. Now it's a Baidu map in China."
mhm,
Um
mhm,
all these assets and all these third-party domains, it looks like Chinafy has what we've done is we call it domain compress them so that they
mhm,
come from only a few. So you make, fewer TCP handshakes, shorten the time there. So unless you're
mhm,
really looking and you're command optioning I into Chrome Inspect to find out what we've done,
mhm.
people can't really tell. And that
Yeah.
probably means we've done our job well.
Absolutely, absolutely, and again, that's the key with such a sort of like a challenging market. It's like, okay, how do I go in there and, look and feel my best like I've done in, across the world without hopefully, too many technical hurdles. You've also talked about the importance of having local partners in mainland China. So basically, you just mentioned YouTube. One of the goals is to still maintain some video functionality, but with a partner in mainland China that may provide the same service. Is this correct?
Well, if you're using Chinafy, I think we've already considered that, so you don't actually have to set up all these platforms and sign up systems to manually do yourself. I think a lot of developers
Okay.
who've gone the manual route have decided,
Mhm,
"Hey, actually, I'd rather find, a company like Chinafy to sort that out for me because
mhm,
there's just so many things you have to do." But what I will say is local partners are very, very important, in very specific areas. So if you need to be onshore, if you're looking at regulatory, legal, and compliance, you definitely need a local partner or advisory or consultant to help you out there because every company is super different. The legal frameworks are very specific, and obviously operating a business in China is unique. And so
mhm,
having a local partner who is experienced in the areas that you might not be is very, very important. What I will say is we've kind of become either the local partner or the connector to the local partner because we have a very full ecosystem for this reason is because you need experts for different things. When you think of something
mhm,
as simple as, "I just need my website to work in China," you don't expect to then say, "Oh, do I need to review, how my personal information is being collected? Oh, do I need to consider whether my company needs to operate in China? Are we selling a specific product?" You have all these other questions that once you start opening that Pandora's box, a lot of people find very hard to navigate. And sometimes
mhm,
there's language barriers as well, platform technical barriers as well. And so
mhm,
having someone you can trust to help you navigate, I think, is always the best way to go. I mean, it's not so different to traveling, right, abroad. Having someone
mhm,
locally
mhm,
take you just helps a lot. And I will
mhm,
say,
mhm,
especially in China, you definitely need that. And the most helpful thing, if you are helping anyone or a company go into China, is to keep an open mind and kinda leave your preconceived notions, assumptions of what you know at the door. Because
mhm,
doing that will give you fewer headaches than saying, "Hey, but why isn't it as easy as X, Y, and Z?" Or "Why is it so costly?" Um,
mhm.
all these questions I think will deter you from actually reaching that goal faster.
Now, I think you touched on it a little bit, but you've highlighted in the past, the how important and significant the regulatory process is to operate in China.
Yeah.
Did you want to sort of expand on that, in so many words?
Yeah, so, I do have to precursor and say I'm not giving any legal advice just because I need to make sure to do
Understood.
that. But I do think, for example, when it comes to China, a few things that come up frequently is something like an ICP license,
Mhm,
um, or what they call, they have different licenses if it's a commercial purpose or informational site that you host in China. So if you want
mhm,
to say, oh, why can't I just use AWS, spin up a server in China with AWS China? It's not so straightforward because you then need a Chinese business entity. You would then need to get these licenses. Then you need to do something called a police security bureau filing. You need an individual tied to this website. So there are a lot of steps, regulatory wise, that is needed if you're to host a website or to use an onshore CDN, point of presence
mhm,
in China. So that's
mhm,
one level of regulatory work that's involved. And then there's also, the something like the PIPL, which I would say it's kind of the China equivalent of GDPR with different
mhm,
requirements as well, right? So personal information protection and things like that. And
mhm,
so there are these regulatory and legal components that are involved with operating a website inside China and being mindful
mhm.
of, yeah, not being flagged for the wrong reasons or for negligence in that space. What
Yeah.
I will say is interesting is through our experience, in over 5 plus years of actively working in this space, and so many different companies that we've worked with is oftentimes the legal and regulatory component is convoluted with the technical components, right? The legal and regulatory things you have to address and to research and to do is separate to the technical portion. So
Mhm,
just because you host in China doesn't mean the website necessarily works well. Just because you get an ICP license doesn't mean the website works well, and vice versa. To make a website work well doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be hosted onshore, or it will then depend on the situation or the company that you're in, and frankly, what you're looking to achieve. Um,
Yeah, because you had described it in the past and, trying to explain to an audience, the importance of these licenses and again, having a partner online, I mean, on mainland, that's it. Not like online. No. Mainland China
Absolutely.
and exactly. Yeah, yeah, ideally. And again, they just sort of like adding to this sort of like, is sort of like Macedon of just kind of like, holy smokes, like what's going on here? And I just want to sell some shoes. Uh, let's look at some of the details here. Back to the report, like performance metrics breakdown. Now, we're seeing like some classic details here. Like time to first byte that you're seeing. Over a second and a half, which is almost twice as what is recommended as good. Render start, speed index, one of my favorite metrics. And again, nearly 10 seconds for speed index, which is apparently the 1.8 to 2.1 times the average, is what I'm saying.
The average, yeah,
Uh,
Virginia, and then
yeah, exactly, exactly. Load time, that's a classic one, obviously. Now, you'd also mentioned something. Oh yeah, I in the past that I also heard you talk about this sort of like onshore, offshore situation with respect to creating the presence for a client. Did you want to sort of, go through that quickly? Because I think you had like 3 or 4 tiers of situations that a client could kinda use.
yeah, absolutely. So, um, first to define, no, onshore and offshore simply means if something is hosted onshore within
Mhm,
mainland China, offshore meaning anything else that's outside. And so the
mhm,
situations that we see that companies fall into, there's one of 3. The first one
mhm,
is they have a fully onshore stack. They're fully, China-based operations, everything from sales, marketing to their messaging and their infrastructure is fully onshore, and that's a fully onshore company, and that's bucket number
mhm,
1. Bucket number 2 is kind of a hybrid, right? You might, for example, have built something in a cloud environment. Let's say you use, I don't know, maybe but I think Webflow is a good example. Let's just say Webflow. So
mhm, mhm,
Webflow, let's say you've chosen to use Webflow, you can't change the hosting environment and host that same Webflow website in China because you're
mhm,
using cloud resources. The same goes for if you're using Shopify. You can't exactly
mhm,
just move your Shopify stack onshore in China. But there might be some elements in which you actually need to keep. For example, if you have enough information that you're collecting, um, on an online form from a visitor in China, you might need to have that form's data sit within China in this example. In which case, you have some of a hybrid model where some elements are actually within the borders of China and other elements are offshore. And then obviously the third bucket is a fully offshore website where everything you have sits outside of China. Everything that you're managing, running company-wise is outside of China. And so companies
Mhm.
fall within these 3 buckets. And it's really largely defined by the customer in terms of what they need to achieve and honestly what kind of requirements they need to meet as a company, um, for that website.
Mhm. And obviously, with that comes sort of like architecture differences, challenges, and the idea of, I guess, being on mainland China will be the most involved one in terms of like making all the needed changes for them to be present on the Chinese internet as best as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the starting point of these companies. Oftentimes, when
Mhm,
companies are coming to us, they would have already had a website built. So, what we're
mhm,
given is, do you want to really rebuild from scratch, or what can we do with what you already have? And I think it's
mhm,
really important to highlight what we're talking about here is we're not talking about scaling a company's presence. We're talking about simply making sure the foundations are set for them to then
mhm,
invest in marketing, for them to invest in SEO, SCM, every bit of that portion, paid ads, everything like that. So
mhm,
the foundation is really what we're talking about here. And again, it really depends on the website. What I will say is that assuming, the legal and the regulatory is more or less straightforward, resolved, and they present us a website, let's just say a standard dynamic corporate website for their real estate company, for example.
mhm,
The process that we've managed to streamline is it still takes us about 1.5 weeks, working weeks, to kind
mhm,
of optimize that website, in order to make it work well for visitors in China. We can do it in as fast as 72 hours, obviously with more engineers in place, but it still takes a little bit of time. Uh,
mhm.
and so the amount of work that we're putting in really depends on how complex that website is and how much custom work is required to make that version work for visitors in China.
So that just brought up a thought in my head. Do you have a particular time of year where you have a lot of clients knocking on your door? Meaning, um, like for example, and I don't know, maybe we spoke about this or someone recently, but I was thinking of Singles Day, and whether or not companies outside of China want to be in the market for that moment. Um, but do you have particular, times of the year where it's like, okay, we're going to have a rush of clients come in because they want to take advantage of this sort of like big retail event or big holiday event in China?
I would say the best example of the urgency comes from companies that are throwing conferences and events in China. Interestingly enough, it's that is super, super urgent because it's only when, let's say, a week before the event, they say, "Hey, actually, we've got some people, we built this really wonderful conference event site and we've flown into China. Why doesn't it work?" And then so everyone starts scrambling. The problem isn't felt until that very last minute moment, in which case we also then, try to resolve that more urgently. So I'd say conferences and events is a big thing because having people experience that from one side to the other is something that's a very short term, very urgent matter. Another thing we'll find is that we see a lot of urgency, frankly, before the end of the year because I think a lot of people are thinking, we're planning for the next year. We've got budgets to, set sort out. We need to
Mhm.
think about how to improve our own website. And once they start looking to this website, they then think, oh, actually, by chance we've run some tests. Why is it so slow? Why are people not seeing it in China? Or more often than not, it's because someone somewhere has received a complaint from someone somewhere within mainland China to say, "Hey, why doesn't this work?" Either a customer, which is probably the most direct complaint model or someone in their local offices. Because what happens is a lot of these companies will have their marketing teams, their agencies, everyone outside of China, but they might have a sales team locally within China, or a distributor partner. And because of that, you then find that there's all this friction and firsthand experiences that shine light on this issue that they didn't know existed before.
That's interesting. You're saying that you get a lot of sort of like Russian jobs because people didn't realize that, something as simple as each like a conference website is not going to be operational. And then they're knocking on the door saying, "Hey, what's going on here? Can you fix this?"
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Because and I realize, like, a lot of these reports, without giving you a kind is an entrance, is actually a lot of people just don't know that this is a problem. I don't think it's an intentional thing that people are doing or companies are doing is, "Oh, yeah, I really don't care about China, and therefore this is why the website is so slow." I wouldn't say actually, probably majority of these hotels really do care that their websites aren't working. Some of them, I will say, care so much that they already have a local partner, maybe they already have a separate local site. So, that part isn't factored into this data specifically. We're talking about their global websites. But I will say, most people just don't know because
Mhm.
it's not in their regular practice when checking a website,
Mhm.
especially if they're not traveling to and from China, to
Yeah.
say it's not working because everywhere else it's working fine, it's looking beautiful, it's doing its
Yeah.
job. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's
Yeah.
not an intentional thing, but what I will say is once someone knows this, it would be shocking if they did nothing about it.
I mean, especially if they need to be there for whatever reason, they need to advertise there. They need to let people know that it's, this link is available, and next thing you know, it's just not. Wow. And you just mentioned that again, China being that sort of like very special market that most people don't know about. Um, have you seen any other market come, I should say as close, but to have like similar challenges in terms of like operating in that geo? So we know China is like a very special case. Is there any other market that you know of that might be even close to that, regulatory internet challenge geo?
What I will say is, obviously, I haven't worked as extensively in other markets. There's always that. But I do think there are obviously other markets in which there are specific issues that do pop up specific for them, right? Let's just say in Indonesia, Vimeo doesn't work. If you were to use Google Maps, I believe in Korea, you might run into some issues. The pins for locations might not work as well. Platforms aren't working the same way. Those all exist. But again, it comes back to what China is unique on is one, its scale. No other market has that scale that China has. And the second part is the combined constraints of what makes China's market unique. So, I can probably list 3 to 5 off the top of my head. One are the cross-border traffic controls that you've mentioned earlier in our conversation, ISP, IXPs. Then there is the specific regulatory framework that exists for China, which we kind of roughly touched upon. There's obviously its unique digital tools and the more widespreadness of third-party platform incompatibilities. And so, yeah, yes, to your question, there are definitely geos and markets, but none with China's scale and none with this stack of constraints.
No, it's absolutely fascinating when you really sort of like dig into the details and realize how tough it can be to sort of enter the market. And, let's get into this conversation. You talked about, preparing to get into that market and having your resources ready. And you said in the past that, working to operate into the Chinese geo can be expensive in terms of just like allocating the resources to get this done. Obviously, this is where Chanify comes in. It's like, hey, you know what? You guys might try to do it internally, but we can sort of help you out and manage these costs for you. Is this something that, companies realize that this is going to be an additional expense that obviously may come back to them in terms of like, I don't know, retail sales or whatever it might be? Are many of them realizing that, the cost to operate in China is fairly elevated.
I think it comes down to expectations. The reason that something feels expensive to any company is because they didn't expect themselves having to invest it, right? So someone might find $100 expensive, some might find $10,000 expensive. And I think it comes down to expectation because I think there is truly a large gap in the awareness around what is involved to entering that market in China, especially let's just say with something as simple as a website. So when we mentioned earlier, right, a lot of people might go through the tools. Obviously, if I wanted to make this website work, why don't I just bolt on a CDN? Why don't I just add a global
Mhm.
accelerator? Marginal costs that I'm familiar with. What they're not familiar with is why isn't this tool working? What is third-party plugins? What are the nuances and things I have to fix? Why is it always changing? So there is that cost element that frankly people just aren't aware about. And I think similarly to enter a large market and as a promising market as China is that there is a lot of competition. You are competing with local companies who are very good at what they do. You're competing with global companies that are doing very, very well, with whatever they're doing, what product offering they have. Let's just say, even if they have a USP, the challenge is, again, it comes down to expectation. And a lot of times, I think people just frankly underestimate the work that's involved to entering that market and succeeding in that market. It's one thing to get your foot in the door. It's another thing to make sure you're investing, contributing, building, and improving it. Not so different to, let's just say, improving your SEO. A lot of people might think if they haven't worked with SEO before, it's a one-time thing. No, it's something you have to continue to fix, continue to improve on, continue to invest in. And that's the same with China, except it's not just SEO, it's SEM, it's the foundations of the website, it's, influencers, KOLs, things like that. There's a lot involved. And so therefore, it's expensive to people who don't know the costs involved in doing that. But people who've done their research, let's just say even people who've looked into setting up a business in China or are aware of the cost of a China CDN versus a global CDN, a lot of them will then realize it's a relative cost.
Mhm, mhm. You mentioned the, local businesses. Do they have a sort of inherent advantage of being local in terms of, do they have some of the same costs associated as opposed to, say, like, I don't know, LVMH trying to come in?
Well, I mean, from an infrastructure standpoint, they only really need one business entity if you're starting off in China versus if
Mhm,
you are someone that needs 2 entities then to be in a different market. I think this
mhm,
sort of challenge is not distinctive or unique to China. It's pretty much the same if you, I'm assuming, want to set up an office in multiple
mhm,
markets, you would have to kinda go through the basic steps if you need to be onshore and within the borders, right? In person for retail. But, I would also say the other advantage is familiarity with the platforms that you need to play with,
mhm,
right? If you're local,
mhm,
you're frankly using these things every single day. You're using WeChat every day. You are using, Tmall. You are familiar with the interface. You know how to tap into the local market. You already know who the local partners are, and you know the laws involved. So I think
mhm,
there's always a local advantage to every market that you're in. And when it comes to
mhm,
China, I think there is a true language barrier for some companies if they don't know who to partner with to help navigate. Because if you're
mhm,
talking about a lot of the interfaces that you might have to use, let's just say Baidu Webmaster Tools, it's primarily in simplified Chinese. If you are trying to read documentation, data, instructions, that's probably gonna be in simplified Chinese. You can use a translate tool on top of it, but it's not gonna be the same. So, again, this probably comes down to finding a local partner and turning any go-to-market experience that you have into an advantage.
incredible. And again, it's like building out like a second presence ultimately, and
Right.
having an org like Chinafy just really set you up for success and have you understand what it's like to operate in this market. Using a different CDN. Making sure that the architecture is something that's going to be usable in this market. And, I was thinking of, I was going back to, looking at your talk, and like we've always had these conversations about particular architectures or frameworks, even, or CMSs. It's like, oh, this CMS is slow, that CMS is slow, or this one's actually the better one because X, Y, and Z. But ultimately, there's nothing that's really of preference when you go into the Chinese geo. It's really just about like the proper setup, because each and every framework is going to have its own challenge working into that market.
Exactly, exactly. It's almost like, when you think about entering a country that majority speaks a different language, You shouldn't
Yeah.
expect everything that you know to apply. And I think
Yeah.
the people who do best in going to market in China are people who are both very dedicated and humble in terms of the way they approach it.
That's well put because, again, just you looking at, all the data that you guys have shared in the past, it's just been sort of, like, fascinating. And again, someone who thinks that, they've built up like, I'd love to know what, um, Tim Vriek's ScaleMate's website does, how well it does in China. I'll have to kick him about that because
Um,
he's always he's always talking about, like, some second LCPs or something like that. So,
they might have done
you know
well.
you
They might have done well.
hey, listen, I'm gonna have to ask him. Uh, I mean, like,
We'll send attachments back.
yeah, totally. We've been chatting so much, but, we didn't spend a ton of time on the performance report, but we've talked about a lot of the details that are in the report. Now, if someone wanted to, actually, I know you shared it at some point. If someone wanted to check out, oh, no, there we go. I want to come back here. The report, is this where they would, it should come up. This one right here. Is that
There
correct?
it is. That's the one.
Awesome. I mean, I'm going to share that in the show notes nonetheless. Jody, I do want to thank you for your time today. We definitely spent a long time chatting away because, again, this is like new territory for me, anyhow. Having the opportunity to talk about a sort of geo and all its challenges there. This gets back to I don't know if you remember, Google had this program called NBU, which was Next Billion Users, and they talked about, I do have a question that just came in, so I'll bring it up in a second. But they talked about just working in, markets or looking at markets outside of like the general ones that we know. And I think that team was sort of like dissolved or something like that. But, you know, China 5 kind of brings you back to that idea of really taking some time and looking at, foreign markets and seeing how they operate. Obviously, China being one of the more challenging ones, but, I'd love to know what's going on in sort of like South America, you know, or
I would as well. I would as well.
an in-depth look at what happens in India. So I do have something that was just shared here. Random thought. I wonder if some DNS queries and TLS search checks are slower in or from China.
If
Did you
some
want to check?
queries themselves or if they're slower in general, well, I think they're definitely slower in general, and actually a really great tool I'd recommend you using is the web page test tool, and then you open the resource waterfall, and then you can break it down to actually see the DNS queries and the TLS, cert checks. They are both I don't know if this is answering the question, but yes, they are definitely both slower, uh, when you're trying to obviously access them in China, and it's the reason that we try to minimize the number of trips that are needed to make those TCP handshakes on different domains, and we do that domain compression precisely because it really does add up very quickly, and you haven't even started getting to the rest of it.
And again, it's the idea that everything just slows down, and then,
Absolutely.
how do you manage that situation? And I say everything slows down. That's if it actually happens in the first place. You talked about a lot of the timeouts, and you've even mentioned in the past, like there's a handful of sites that just do not operate in China, period.
Right.
So it's that's going to be very important to maintain. You were just going to say
Yeah.
something? Sorry.
I was actually. I think one thing that most people can check very easily is also if the website is blocked, in which case we probably block for official reasons, in which case even a partner like Chinafy we probably wouldn't do very much for, is there are definitely a percentage of websites that are blocked for official reasons, content reasons,
Mhm.
certain categories. But I would say actually the majority are not just outright blocked, is that there's
Mhm.
probably something you can do about it. So from that perspective, I think it's very optimistic. And I wanted to follow up on the DNS question is I wasn't sure in reading it second time, I wasn't sure if they're asking for specific DNS resolvers or if
Mhm.
they're just asking in general. But of course, if you find a local DNS resolver, it will help address some of the speed, whether it's from,
Yeah.
Ali DNS or Tencent. But I think from an overall picture, you're talking about milliseconds, at most a second or two, but everything else is what really stretches out.
Yeah.
That's where the resource waterfall comes in.
Yeah.
I hope that
No,
answered your
absolutely.
question, I think it's from Ozzy Whitperf
Yeah.
3%.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, no, and again, the idea that everything just slows down is basically why Chinafy is around, helping developers and helping larger orgs, um, break into the market that you said is number 2 in the world. So, I mean, that's obviously going to be some of the motivation to make sure that they make their attempts to grow their own retail pie. If someone has been tapped in, has been just blown away by this conversation and now understands that they need to sort of ready themselves and go through a number of steps and wants to get in touch with you and Chinafy, what should they do?
They should just directly email me. Jodie@chinafy.com is an email address they can use. They can also find me on LinkedIn, Jodie Chan, I'm
Mhm,
sure. You've also tagged me in everything. I've got the Blue Sky app, we've got X, we've got all the channels, so feel free to just drop
mhm,
me a message, and I'm happy to have a chat. I think the best way is to ask me a very specific question, with a specific website because, like I mentioned, every case is very, very unique, and if
mhm,
you wanna dig into this further, let's chat about it.
mhm. Here's a good question. Are the majority of your clients like large clients that come around? Like you'd mentioned LVMH, I know you had an example. I don't know if they're clients of yours, but I think you worked with Allbirds potentially.
Well, we haven't worked with those 2 clients. I do use their
Okay.
websites partially for those
Oh, okay.
reasons because there are some stark contrasts we can use there. So, if I don't if I'm not mistaken, Allbirds actually has a China presence, and it's a completely separate
Mhm,
website that they've set up, and,
mhm,
I think the way I'd probably frame it is, the majority of companies that we tend to work with are mid to large sized companies with
mhm,
a multinational presence. And the reason for that is they're probably the first people to discover that they have an issue, probably because they have an
mhm,
IT team, they have an agency team. We aren't limited to working with them, but what I will say is it's very likely that someone who's built a portfolio site for themselves will use something like Chinafy because, as I've mentioned, maybe for what they're looking to do, the cost might not make sense
mhm,
because it is a very difficult thing to navigate on your own, and it's also quite
mhm,
costly otherwise to hire someone to do it relative if it's like the personal for fun portfolio site, right? So
mhm,
I do think the majority of our customers are on the slightly larger end because of that. But I would say probably the smaller customers that we have by sheer size of their employees are a lot of Shopify sites, for example. Shopify sites come to find us a lot, and of the CMS platforms, they're probably the most you know, they're the easiest to kind of get started, right? Using a template and someone can spin up a e-commerce site. Sometimes these, Shopify sites, they aren't even looking to sell directly in China, they just wanna be able to be visible to a visitor from China, and that visitor from China might travel abroad to buy their product, they might just want them to know about the brand. So it's not always about direct retail, and I think that's a very interesting thing to think about is making your website work is almost like having a very basic business card so that someone knows
mhm.
that you exist. You're not even talking about a transaction there, you're talking about informational
Yeah,
sharing, and I
yeah.
think that's why whether you're mid to large size or slightly smaller, if China as a market matters to you or you have potential people you need to work with there, then obviously the investment then makes sense.
Uh, any, closing statements before we kind of wrap this up?
I would say if you're back and you've already watched my talk before, I hope that somehow, somewhere you've derived something new from what we've shared. And if
Mhm,
you're new to this chat, again, similar to what you've said in the introduction, I would love to connect, hear any more questions that I might not have answered in this space, just because I do think there's so many levels and there's so many nuances that we can kind of delve into depending on how you approach the questions that you might have.
no,
I think it's
it is
fascinating. It's something I'm happy to chat on.
it is totally fascinating. And again, I'm sure we just scratched the surface. It was kind of like these very kind of like random questions left and right. But between the insights that you guys published in the report, hopefully, this chat and our sort of like kind of like almost random back and forth, and then again, I'll share a few of the talks that she's given. I think at the very least, your curiosity should be there. you know? So if anyone's ready to make that leap, hopefully they'll get in touch with you. Jody, thank you very much for your time this evening.